Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Magda Seewald and I'm a project coordinator at VIDC, the Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation. And I'm very happy to welcome you all to our today's conference on state formation in Palestine, an assessment and the way forward. My special welcome goes, of course, to our speakers of today, and I thank you all for coming, the speakers, the discussions, and the chairs. Thank you all for participating. Most of the speakers are, I would say, old friends of the VIDC because they participated already in previous events on Palestine here in Vienna with us. Today's conference is part of a project called Alternative Models of State Formation in Palestine, Israel, which is a cooperation between the Center for Development Studies at Birzeit University, Palestine, the VIDC, and the Open Society Institute Amman. And it started in 2013. During one of VIDC's previous conferences on Palestine with the title, What Kind of Palestinian State for what kind of peace, which took place in November 2010, scholars and politicians discussed different forms of statehood from Palestinian, Israeli, Arab, and Europe perspectives. You may find some of the last copies of this conference outside in the information desk. What became clear during that conference was that the profound research on alternative models of statehood is crucial. Therefore, we supported the idea of the Center for Development Studies at Birzeit University to investigate how alternative models of statehood can provide an inclusive framework which upholds citizenship rights for all, reconciles individual and collective rights, and moves us towards a society that provides justice, equality, and human security for all its citizens in Palestine, Israel. And also, a Palestinian state has received more international endorsement in these last months. Just recently, the EU Parliament stated in a resolution that it supports, and I quote here, in principle recognition of Palestinian statehood and the two-state solution, end of quote. The situation on the ground with the ongoing fragmentation of the Palestinian territory, as well as the presence of more than 500,000 Israeli settlers, have rendered the prospect of a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine difficult, if not impossible. Today, we will look beyond such a two-state solution and presenting outcomes of the project. Leila Farsakh, one of the researchers in the project, will give us soon more details about the project. Before handing over to Leila, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Center for Development Studies and Samia Al-Botme in particular for the excellent cooperation in these last years. Without her engagement, the project would not have been possible. Unfortunately, Samia Al-Botme had to cancel her trip this weekend to come here to Vienna, and I can affirm you she is very sorry about that, as we are. Let me also thank the Open Society Institute Amman and the Austrian Development Corporation for their financial support, not only for this conference, but for the whole project. I would like also to thank the Diplomatic Academy for its cooperation and my colleague from the VIDC for their support in organizing this conference. Due to the absence of Samia Al-Botme and unfortunately also that of Helmut Krieger, we rearranged the conference program a bit, as you can see in the program we distributed outside. On your chairs, you will find feedback sheets for your comments and critique, and you are invited to fill them in and put them outside in the red box. I'm sure today's conference will bring lots of thought-provoking ideas and perspectives, and I wish us all an interesting conference and may ask Leila now to present the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for VIDC for inviting us, and thank you for making possible this project that is done by the Center for Development Studies in Brazil University, where I'm affiliated. And I regret that my very dear friend and colleague Samuel Butme could not be with us today. And I was given the task to explain the project that you financed, and I think is a very important project that seeks to look at what are the alternative to the political impasse we're around and what are the alternative forms of state formation in Palestine. What is so important about this project, as Magda explained a little bit before, is that its aim was to try and understand what kind of state model can allow us to guarantee or to provide three very important things in any state project, which is basically protection of citizen rights, ensuring security and peace for all those living in the area, and how to protect collective and individual rights of people on the land. Now, it might seem strange, many people would think, why just at a point when over 139 states have acknowledged and recognized a Palestinian state, and at a time when a Palestinian state has been admitted to the UN as a non-member state, precisely at this point when we have international support for idea of a Palestinian state, people are working on alternative models and alternative ideas. And the reason really is in three main factors which are very important. I need to show you the point. The first one is that despite all this international recognition manifested, international recognition of a two-state solution, first manifested with UN Resolution 181, secondly presented with UN Resolution 242 that calls for a solution based on exchange of recognition for land, despite the US-sponsored roadmap that called for the establishment of a Palestinian state as a necessary element of peace, despite even Israeli recognition of it willing to accept a Palestinian state. Despite all that, what we have on the ground is not Palestinian statehood. What we have a Palestinian Authority with very limited territorial jurisdiction. Palestinians today feel that the Palestinian Authority, that is an important acquisition, does not provide the minimum protection of Palestinian citizen rights, does not provide the minimum of Palestinian economic rights, and does not provide a minimum of Palestinian social rights. And that's largely because despite all the concessions that the Palestinian Authority and the PLO have done, from recognizing Israel, from accepting to create a state on 22% of historic Palestine, from accepting the Oslo Agreement that did not stipulate that at the end of the negotiation process there will be a state, despite the security cooperation, which is very intense and well coordinated by the admission of the Israeli government between the Palestinian Authority and the government of Israel, despite all the international funds that has been put into the Palestinian economy, today we don't have any viable economy. What we have instead, we have what we call a one-state apartheid reality. We have basically one single entity which is sovereign and dominant in the area between the river and the sea. That's basically Israel. And what the Palestinians have is a Palestinian Authority with limited functional jurisdiction and no territorial jurisdiction, has territorial jurisdiction only on 22% of Palestine. So that's that fact that Palestinians, despite all these concessions, do not have the element of a state, had led us to want to understand how can we go beyond this impasse rather than just saying, no, we have to implement at all cost a two-state solution, which is not viable. Secondly, the Oslo peace process, although it was a very important peace, the first peace signed between Palestinians and Israeli, based on a very important admission and recognition of Israel, of the existence of the Palestinian people and of Palestinians of the existence of Israel and the right to Israel to exist. Instead of laying the ground for preparing separation and partition between Palestinians and Israelis, actually laid the ground of what I call an Israeli version of an apartheid. And the elements of this apartheid are really three. First are the settlements. Settlements are the blue dots that you see on this map. During the Oslo peace process, settlements doubled rather than decreased. In 1993, we had only 100,000 settlers in the West Bank and another 120,000 in East Jerusalem. By 2014, we have 550,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Secondly, Israel built the separation barrier. Separation barrier, separation wall is a 703 kilometers wall, which is this black and red lines that you see there. This wall is not on the 1967 border on which UN Resolution 242 is based. It rather takes 10% of the West Bank, and above all cuts the north of the West Bank from the south of the West Bank because it incorporates Jerusalem, whole of Jerusalem. Although East Jerusalem is recognized occupied land, it links it to Israel. Thirdly, Israel devised a complicated system of checkpoints and closure that fundamentally fragments the West Bank into little enclaves, population enclaves. Today we have over 89 checkpoints in the West Bank. Can you go down? Yeah. These points, the yellow points you see, where are the checkpoints, the major checkpoint terminals going into Qalandia or into Za'atara or in Hebron or Qalqilia, which basically prevent Palestinian mobility from the areas within the checkpoints to outside the checkpoints. You need to have a permit. The permit is issued by the Israeli authority, not the Palestinians. So basically what you've seen over the past 20 years is not territorial contiguity of the West Bank, but rather a territorial fragmentation of the West Bank and economic fragmentation. And also what you've had, they had the split with Gaza. Gaza has been under siege since 2006. You've had 4 wars by Israel against Gaza that had destroyed the economy and the livelihood of the population. And economically, the Palestinian economy, despite the injection of over $1 billion a year in terms of aid, is still unable to stand on its own feet. We have in Gaza poverty rate of 45%, and in the West Bank we have poverty rates of around 22%. Unemployment in Gaza is of the order of 45%, and in the West Bank of the order of 16%, which is particularly high. So on all these levels, on a political level, we don't have a viable Palestinian state. On a practical level, we don't have any viable Palestinian state. And materially, what we have on the ground is a system of partition, but partition not based on two-state solution, partition based on segregation in a reality, in an apartheid reality. So this is what induced us to want to go and see, okay, what are alternative models? And there are various models that both Zionist thinkers and Palestinian thinkers thought about already before, when the conflict was going on in the before the creation of the State of Israel, but also after the State of Israel. And often this model is what people talk about, the one-state solution, and there are really two versions of the two-state solution. You have the binational state and the democratic state. And most recently, news researchers have been talking about what they describe as a parallel state structure, which is a version of a binational state. Basically, you acknowledge the existence of two states, and you bound them together in a common foreign policy and a common defense policy. Our aim was to look into these various models and see what is attractive about them and what is problematic about them. Because if many people are in agreement that the two-state solution is dead, it doesn't mean that the one-state solution is just around the corner. And the complicated issues about the one-state solution are quite vast in comparison to the two-state solution. And there are issues of power and justice, issues of principles that needs to be discussed and looked into in order to understand what could make a certain model of statehood that can give collective and individual rights to Palestinians and Israeli in Palestine. So what we tried to do is two things. One was a survey, and this is the first survey we have, a survey of 800 households in the West Bank, Gaza, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel, in other words, inside 48, to assess what is their view of a Palestinian state. Are they attached to a Palestinian state? Do they care about a Palestinian state? And I will discuss the finding in my presentation. And secondly, also, what do they think of a joint state with Israelis? Would they be receptive to that? Do they think it's a bad idea? It's a good idea? Why is it good? Why is it not good? And what is required to achieve that state? Particularly issues of economic reconciliation, but above all, political reconciliation. How can we live with the other is a fundamental question when you want to address any solution to the conflict. The two-state solution was based on the idea is that historical reconciliation can be done by mutual recognition. I recognize, the Palestinians recognize the existence of Israel, and Israel recognized the existence of the Palestinian people. But it did not try to look into the injustices and the problems of already 48. It stuck on all development that happened after 1967 war. And actually, the impasse that we are in here is making many people raise the question that maybe if we want to move forward and find a solution, be it two-state, three-state, no state, there are fundamental principles and fundamental injustices and fundamental recognitions that need to be discussed in the open in order to see how to move forward. In other words, a set of principles that need to be addressed. So we are still in the phase of research. With some of the papers presented here are part of that research. We're hoping that we also will be publishing together with VIDC a book that has our findings of this research. There are some very, very interesting things, often that surprise us as researchers, but also indicate to us how we need to think in creative way and also in ways that accommodate the reality of we are today. We cannot undo history, but we can decide if we want to continue with a history based on an injustice or a history that can be inclusive of everybody. So I'll stop at this point, and I'll let us start with the second panel. Thank you very much.
So I have the pleasure to send to you a warm welcome to our first panel discussion. My name is Rami Tagian. I will be the chair of the first panel. The title of the panel is Alternatives to Partition, the Politics of State Formation in Palestine. The members of this panel will be first Tariq Dana. Tariq Dana is an Al-Shabaka policy advisor and also faculty member at the MA program of International Studies at Ibrahim Abu Lughat Institute at the Beirut University. He received his PhD from the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Italy, where his focus was on the transformation of Palestinian civil society from mass-based movements to neoliberal-oriented NGOs. During this period, he was a PhD visiting fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He has worked with many Palestinian international NGOs and UN agencies in the occupied Palestinian territory, Africa, and Europe. His research interests include civil society, NGOs, and social movements, neoliberalism, globalization, and state building with a particular focus on Palestine. Our second presenter, and you heard her already with a very good general introduction to the conference, is Leila Farsakh. She's associate professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She's the author of Palestinian Labor Migration to Israel, Labor, Land and Occupation, published in 2005 and second published in 2012. And editor of Commemorating of the Nakba, Evoking the Nakba, a special volume of Electronic Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, published in the spring of 2008, as well as in numerous other journals in several academic journals. Since 2008, she has been a senior research fellow at the Center for Development Studies at the Beirut University in the West Bank. And in 2001, Dr. Farsakh won the Peace and Justice Award from the Cambridge Peace Commission in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So first we will have these two presenters, and third we will have also a discussant, Gertraud Auer Borea. She's Secretary General of the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue. Prior to this role, assumed in 2005, she worked as project manager at the Bruno Kreisky Forum. From 1990 to 1995, as staff member, international and cultural affairs advisor at the Federal Minister for Education and the Arts in Austria. And from 1980 to 1919, as a freelance professional. And maybe at this occasion, I will also introduce you to the very newly published journal from the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue, which is exactly on the topic of this conference, rethinking the politics of Israel and Palestine, partition, and its alternatives, and you will find some samples outside at the information desk. Just to give you an outline of how the first panel, the order of the first panel, first Tariq will start with his presentation. Second, Leila, and third, we will have the discussant. Afterwards, you will also have the opportunity to answer to some of the issues raised by Gertraud, and then I will open the floor, open the discussion to the floor, and you have the opportunity to answer, comment, questions, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm really glad to be with you here to give this presentation about the economic situation in Palestine and its relation to the ongoing process of state building that has been there for the last 20 years. Throughout the past 48 years, that is since the occupation of 1967 of the occupied territories of West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian economy underwent different stages of transformations. These transformations have been shaped by new political and institutional factors, as well as the entry of new international and transnational actors. All these dynamics, however, have not challenged or altered the Israeli colonial structure and its domination over every aspect of Palestinian life. On the contrary, much of these dynamics have been primarily determined by the Israeli security, political, and economic interest at the expense of Palestinian rights and self-determination. After more than 20 years of the failed Oslo process, most observers, if not all actually, do agree on that the Oslo illusion has caused more harm to the Palestinian economy than it was the case in the pre-Oslo era. Even many Palestinians now question the very validity of the notion Palestinian economy, given the fact that any national economy requires certain essential foundations that are defined by certain or specific criteria. In the context of the occupied territories, these foundations are non-existent, or better say, these economic foundations are fully captured and manipulated by the Israeli apparatus of control, which serves it to deepen its occupation and prevent the emergence of any meaningful Palestinian entity, be it a state or national liberation movement. Well, in this presentation, I will highlight three overlapping factors that are indispensable to understanding the ongoing economic devastation in the occupied territories. These factors are first and above all, Israel's colonial policies. Second is the role of international aid. And third is the form of international designed neoliberal state building implanted in the Palestinian setting. Israeli colonial policies, I start with this by saying that since the initiation of the Oslo process, Israel has successfully managed to deepen its control over key Palestinian economic resources and factors of production. This, however, cannot be properly understood without highlighting the ways of Israeli economic strategies toward the occupied territories since the occupation of 1967. And the latter institutionalization of the Palestinian structural dependency on the Israeli economy as engineered by the Oslo Accords of 1993 and particularly its annex, the Paris Protocol on Economic Relations, which was signed in 1994. Well, the Israeli economic domination of the West Bank and Gaza started at the advent of the occupation in June 1967. The occupied territories at that time was declared as a military area, and since then Israel has issued thousands of military orders and regulations that included various economic aspects that govern Palestinian economic life, with a profound effect that is still very valid to present day. I will start with this quote by Leila Farsakh I borrow here because it powerfully summarizes the Israeli economic strategy since the occupation of 1967. That is, between 1967 and 1990, the economy of the West Bank and Gaza Strip witnessed two major contrasting developments. On the one hand, it saw its per capita income double. On the other hand, it witnessed the disintegration of its economic base. Well, in fact, the Israeli economic strategy in the occupied territories aimed at the uprooting and the destruction of the Palestinian economic productive base. At the same time, Israel allowed for a certain level, which is highly controlled, carefully designed level of economic growth as a tool of political pacification. Well, briefly, some of the measures that Israel imposed on the Palestinians shortly after the occupation of 1967. Firstly, it closed down all Arab financial and monetary institutions that existed at that time and replaced them with Israeli banks. It also tied the Palestinian economy to its monetary system by imposing Israeli currency, shekel, but the Palestinians also continued to use, to a lesser extent, the Jordanian dinar, Egyptian pound in Gaza, as well as American dollar. In addition to that, given that Israel controlled all the borders and the entry And the crossing borders, it banned all exports and imports except through the borders, but also in some period, Israel, especially the initial phase of the occupation, Israel allowed for some exchange and export to surrounding countries, particularly Jordan and Egypt, as part of its political strategy called open bridges, which I will talk about later on. Another aspect of Israeli domination is the land confiscation and the explosion of large numbers of the indigenous inhabitants in order to construct its settler colonial regime. In addition to that, Israel imposed high taxes on the Palestinians, different kinds of taxes, such as custom taxes, income taxes, value-added taxes. However, despite all these taxes, Israel invested very poorly in Palestinian infrastructure, which also obstructed, the development of any meaningful development in Palestine. There is also strict licensing for industrial activities. Only a few light industries were allowed to establish in order to supplement Israeli industries, thereby transforming Palestinian manufacturers into subcontractors serving Israeli industries, particularly in food, textile, and clothing. Furthermore, Palestinian industry suffered as a result of the competitiveness from the highly subsidized Israeli industries. Also, Israel maintained control over communications, electricity resources, over borders, terminals, control over water, controlled cultivated area and natural resources, as well as the exploitation of Palestinian labor. Israel dealt with Palestinian workers as a second-class labor force who were exposed to working conditions that allowed Israeli businesses to benefit from offering low wages without having to apply Israeli labor law. All these measures, amongst others, have deprived the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza control over key economic resources and prevented an indigenous development to take place. These measures have led to what's widely known now as Palestinian de-development. Second point is the Israeli colonial policy, the strategies it adopted of economic pacification. The previous measures actually were accompanied with a carefully designed policy of pacification that was conducive to unprecedented economic growth and an increase in income. This was part of a wider political strategy that meant to deter the influence of the PLO in exile, as well as prevent it from recruiting and mobilizing the inhabitants under the occupation and to co-opt resistance. One of these strategies, open bridges, which was proposed by the Israeli defense minister at that time, which allowed Palestinians to trade with Jordan and to a lesser extent with Egypt. This strategy also initially was based on non-interference in internal Palestinian affairs. And according to the Israeli defense minister at that time, the main objective of this policy is to make the occupation invisible. In addition to that, Israel introduced limited modernization, agricultural-related projects, and livestock, but Israel neglected implementing macroeconomic policies that could serve the actual needs of the Palestinian economy. In fact, economic growth between 1967 and 1972 was unprecedented. In the West Bank, it was about 15%, and in Gaza, about 11%. According to Yitzhak Rabin, however, in 1986, he said, there will be no development initiated by the Israeli government, and no permits will be given for expanding agriculture or industry, which may compete with the state of Israel. Now I move to the second stage, which is represented in the Oslo Accords and the institutionalization of Palestinian dependency on Israel. However, I would like to speak briefly about the economic motivations that led Israel to sign the Oslo Accords. In 1985, Israel began to experience economic liberalization, market liberalization, after it was a highly protectionist state. This required, for sure, to create a sort of political stability in order to attract foreign investment and open up new markets, particularly at the regional level, and here I mean Arab states, in order to break the Arab historical boycott of Israeli productions and imports. The key for this was for sure to find a solution for the Palestinian issue. This was expressed by Shimon Peres in his book 1993, New Middle East, in which he envisioned liberal Middle East based on economic interdependence, in which Israel constitutes the core and the rest are dependent periphery. In addition to that, in the initial phases of the negotiations, we could see a powerful influence by Israeli business community played an important role in the early stages and they sought actually to transform the occupation from a colonial into a neo-colonial project in case Palestinians were given a state, and ensure continued economic dependency in order to keep their profits. The Oslo Accords and the self-governing arrangement in the occupied territory were signed in 1994 and began a gradual transfer of certain cosmetic powers, including civil affairs and internal policing, to the National Palestinian Authority. The Oslo Accords was based on the promise of delivering prosperity to the Palestinian people. Some even envisioned that the Oslo Accords will eventually transform the West Bank and Gaza Strip into the Singapore of the Middle East. The most important aspect of the Accords is the Paris Protocol in economic relations, which is an annex to the broader Oslo Accords and is a framework establishing the interim period economic relations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The protocol was signed in 1994 and is it's like a model that established, the most important model established in the protocol is known as a customs union, the primary characteristic of which is the absence of economic borders between members of the union. The practical effect of selecting this model was the preservation of the economic relations that had existed until then. The protocol consists of 11 articles dealing with different economic issues, including taxation policies, trade, insurance, banking, petroleum, agriculture, water, and so on. To examine the impacts of the Paris Protocol on the Palestinian economy. First, it formalized the de facto quasi-custom union that existed since 1967. The customs union is based on the Israeli customs and trade system, including taxation. With its implementation on the ground, it became apparent that the customs union became a one-sided that is fully determined by and in service of the Israeli economic needs. With the complete use of the Israeli tariff structure, the Palestinians were not able to fully benefit from the exceptions allowed for goods imported from Jordan, Egypt, or other Arab countries. The protocol imposed on the PA Israeli policies on customs, custom tariffs, indirect taxes, and health requirements, with some exceptions that allowed the Palestinian Authority to impose a minimum price on petroleum products, with prices as much as 15% lower than Israel. Second, the Paris Protocol left the Palestinian Authority with no control over macroeconomic or exchange rate policy. This is largely due to the absence of Palestinian currency and the Israeli control over every aspect of monetary policy. The Bank of Israel sets its exchange rate and interest rate policies according to its consideration to stabilize inflation and support employment. However, it doesn't take into consideration the implications of its monetary policy on the Palestinian economy. Also, Israel retained control over key resources, including trade and fiscal resources. According to the agreement, Palestinian trade with other countries would continue to be handled through Israeli ports or through border crossings between the Palestinian Authority and Jordan and Egypt, which are also controlled by Israel. The necessity of obtaining Israeli approval to conduct trade leads to substantial economic loss to the Palestinians whenever Israel imposes a comprehensive closure in the occupied territories and cancels all relevant permits. Israel also imposed a tariff structure appropriate to an advanced industrial country, not for a country that is economically poor or can be located in the periphery, actually. The PA has been deprived of the right to develop its own customs tariff structure or to reduce the VAT by more than 2% in a manner reflecting the development interest of the Palestinian economy. This has deepened the dependency of the Palestinian trade sector on Israel, which has also restricted the autonomous growth of the Palestinian industrial sectors and their ability to create job opportunities, thus reinforcing Palestinian dependency on work in Israel. Also, Israel continued control over borders and key factors of productions, including land, water, movement of labor. Although the customs union framework is intended to ensure free flow of workers, for example, the Paris Protocol didn't expressly prevent Israel from prohibiting workers to enter its marketplace. So since the protocol entered into force, Israel has imposed prolonged comprehensive closures on the occupied territories and limited the number of Palestinians given work permits inside Israel. Along the Paris Protocol, we find that the Oslo Accords include certain provisions that have caused the geographical fragmentation, which Leila highlighted before. I would like to talk more about the division of the territories into areas A and B and C. It was divided into area A, which is about 18% of the territories and includes 55% of the population. That is the populated towns and cities such as Ramallah, Hebron, and Nablus. Also, we have area B, which is 20% of the land and about 41% of the population. It's under the Palestinian civil control, but completely under Israeli security control. Area C is about 62% of the land and 4% of the population. It's under full control, security, and civil control of the Israelis. Consider here that both of area A and B are completely surrounded by area C, which is under the Israeli control, and therefore it makes entry and movement very difficult, as well as requires certain permits and different sorts of control that is imposed upon the Palestinians. According to the World Bank report in 2010, and this is actually a very rare statement by this institution, it says the Israeli control has become more sophisticated and effective in its ability to interfere in and affect every aspect of Palestinian life, including job opportunities, work, and earnings, turning the West Bank into a fragmented set of social and economic islands or enclaves cut off from one another. Secondly, we have the issue of this also the recent finding by UNCTAD about the consequences of Paris Protocol in its report published last year, which says how major outcome of the Paris Protocol is the increasing dependency of Palestinian economy over the Israeli economy. For example, dependence on the Israeli market has continued, with imports from Israel reaching over 80% of total Palestinian imports. So because of the time limits, I think I will move to the second issue, which is international aid. And actually, the relationship between international aid and economic development in the context of the Palestinian territories is particularly problematic since the aim of international community was to foster economic development in the OPT in order to stimulate and support the Oslo peace process. According to many researchers, Palestinians have developed a deep-seated dependency on foreign aid to sustain the economy of their isolated enclaves, which are contained by and dependent on Israel for all commercial transactions. Here are some facts about international aid. Since 1994, around 40 donor countries, including 20 UN and other multilateral international organizations and so on, have given aid to the Palestinians. Donor support increased from 180 million in 1993 to almost 2 billion in 2009. Between 1994 and 2012, the occupied territories received over 24 billion of international aid, and this makes the Palestinians the largest recipient of non-military aid in the world, about $360 per capita annually. International aid is the main driver of economic growth in the occupied territories. It's known that International aid to Palestinians is highly conditioned aid for economic survival because it's strictly associated with the conditions of the Oslo peace paradigm. And here is another misconception because the kind of economic development being implemented is more associated with the paradigm of post-conflict zone. However, in Palestine, it's not post-conflict at all. It's still under colonial control. And it wasn't actually followed by a process of decolonization. We see the opposite. Okay. So, despite also international aid was supposed to be an investment in economic development, but this wasn't the issue. For example, between 1994-2000, most of this it was directed to institution building and budget support. Between 2000-2006, international aid went to emergency humanitarian aid, and since 2007, 80% of the aid has gone for the PA budget support instead of supporting economic projects. What is the result here? We see 50% of Palestinians lived in poverty in 2010, 38% the West Bank, 70% in Gaza. We find also 50% of Palestinian households suffer from food insecurity, according to World Food Programme. 30% unemployment, 47% in Gaza and 20% in the West Bank. For youth, also it's still worse because about 43% of youth in Palestine are unemployed. In addition to that, international aid has created certain class in the Palestinian society that's highly dependent on this aid, middle class, which also widened inequality gap within the West Bank as well as between the West Bank and Gaza since the division of 2007. What's the general critiques that's directed at international aid? We see here that international aid to the occupied territories is considered apolitical, seeking technical solutions to mitigate economic damage rather than political solutions that will enable structural reform. In addition, donor practices complement and intersect with Israel's methods of control in crucial but subtle ways. Foreign aid effectively perpetuates the situation in which the Palestinians are a nation of consumers who are unable to produce and unable to compete with the Israeli economy. And the third point is neoliberal state building. I will speak briefly here because my colleague here will speak more about it. We have two phases of neoliberal state building in Palestine, according to my opinion. First, we can see the World Bank report of 1993 called Developing the Occupied Territories and Investment in Peace, which was issued even before the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which set this global institution vision on how Palestinian economy ought to function, and it was based on very neoliberal principles of Washington Consensus. Secondly, the Palestinian Authority in its type of constitution, Palestinian Basic Law, in its Article 21, it says the economic system in Palestine shall be based on the principles of free market economy. And it's a bit controversial, this issue, because firstly, it's really rare to find in constitutions, including in the West, the capital center of the world, a clear statement in their constitution that there's a free market economy here, including the United States. You cannot find the term free market economy in its constitution. In addition to that, many people in Palestine oppose the logic of free market economy in the context of state building. They think or believe that the Palestinian Authority should adopt a more protectionist policies as initial step for the state building. And during the 1990s, this has led to the emergence of the PA crony capitalism. It's a combination of corruption, concentration of power, political and economic power in the hands of few elite, who enjoyed close relations with certain Israeli figures, formal security and politicians, and certain businesses. And this has eventually led to what was famous at that time, the monopolies. Over 25 key commodity was monopolized by those elite who maintained this power. And phase two, which is the most important and more controversial, which is associated with the former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad since 2007. It was clearly articulated in the Palestinian Reform and Development Plan issued by his government, which drew upon a detailed series of proposals written by the World Bank. You know, this phenomenon then in Palestine became Fayyadism, they call it Fayyadism, or third way because it rejects the first way, which is the armed struggle that was adopted by PLO since the late 60s. It also rejects the second way, which is negotiations that was started with Oslo process and failed, so he just proposed his third way, which is based on the assumption that if we build a state institutions based on neoliberal principles with the help and assistance of international financial institutions, we will eventually impose a new reality on the ground and convince international community to recognize Palestine as a state. This was a bit paradoxical because usually this kind of logic comes after liberation or after self-determination, not before. His report focused on private sector expansion, public sector fiscal reform, or we can call it austerity measures. Also security, because security in Palestine is really problematic because it absorbs much of the Palestinian Authority's budget. It's around 35%, which exceeds actually the money allocated for education, for agriculture, or even for health. And it's one aspect of neoliberal reform in Palestine, which here is the reform of banking sector. We see now the governmental debts amounting to, okay, this last slide, governmental debts amounted to 4.2 billion in 2013, nearly 50% of the GDP, annual interest running at, with the annual interest running at 200 million. In addition to that, we find individual loans shot up to about $1 billion in 2013, from 500 million in 2009. The problematic issue here is 75% of public sector employees are in debt. And most of these debts and loans are used for consumption rather than investing in productive activities. I will end here. Thank you very much.
Second will be Leila. On the alternative to partition in Palestine, political challenges and frameworks.
Thank you very much. And what I'll be talking about, just as I said in my introduction and following Tariq, is to try and think about what are the models of alternative to partition. And what I really want to do here is try to examine what are the key political questions that need to be addressed and how they can be addressed. The one-state idea as a solution for two people fighting over the same land is not new. It has been proposed both by Jewish Zionists as well as by Palestinians, and was not unknown to the international community, which is the third very central actor in this ongoing conflict. The appeal of the one-state idea stems from the fact that it promises to protect citizens' rights over what some consider to be chauvinistic nationalist claim, to guarantee equal political rights to all those wishing to live in Palestine, be they Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, immigrants, or natives, Israelis, or Palestinians. Its problem, the problem of the one-state solution, has always been how to reconcile individual political rights with national rights within a single polity. In other words, how to protect citizens' rights, political rights to representation, with equality, with their collective right to speak their own language, protect their own culture, and define themselves as a nation that want to be governed by their own nationals. Proponents of alternative to partition, or the one-state idea, have attempted to tackle this problem by proposing two main political structures for one state. One is called the secular democratic model, the other is the binational state. The secular democratic model of a one state prioritizes individual rights over collective rights and leaves it to specific constitutional arrangements to sort out how you're going to protect collective rights. The binational state, by contrast, envisages a state along the Belgian or the Swiss model, a federated or a confederated state that protects Israeli and Palestinian culture and political institutions, i.e. collective rights, and gives them local autonomy within a single democratic binational state. This would imply that each national group, the Israeli or the Palestinian, will have their own local governments, will levy their own local taxes, will have their own domestic police and speak their own languages and schools, manage their own local educational system. But both groups would be joined together in a federal representative government that could have common control over foreign policy and defense. A new version of it is, as I said earlier, is what they call the parallel state structure. In other words, you will have the state of Palestine and you would have the state of Israel, but you would have shared sovereignty rather than single absolute territorial sovereignty. Now, in order to understand the ability of a one-state alternative to provide a viable solution that can protect collective and individual rights of Palestinian Israelis, it is necessary to understand how historically and today proponents of the one-state idea try to define the relationship between the nation, the state, and sovereignty. In other words, how we try to tackle three key political concepts that we need always to address. One is the question of self-determination. How do we solve the problem of self-determination, people who want to be governed by their own people? Secondly, the question of sovereignty. Where does sovereignty lie? Does it lie in the people or does it lie in the land? Does it depend on territorial control or does it depend on population representation? And thirdly, the question of equality and the right of others. When we are in a democratic state, what do we do with the rights of other people who are not of our same nationality? Do we treat them as second-rate citizens or we treat them as first-rate citizens? And if we treat them equally as equal citizens, how can we protect their individual and political rights? Now, it's important to remember, because people sometimes say, oh, the one-state idea is a crazy idea. It's actually not a crazy idea because it's an old idea. The genesis of the one-state idea can be traced back to the British Mandate, specifically to the period between 1922 and 1929, when Britain, who was the colonial power, demarcated the boundary of Palestine as we know it today, while incorporating the Balfour Declaration. This period between 1922 and 1929, the British treated Palestine as a single administrative unit, recognized Arabic, Hebrew, and English as official languages, and provided for the creation of a legislative council in which Muslim, Jews, and Christian would be represented proportionally. This idea was not too, the Zionist leadership at the time was not too receptive to the idea. The Palestinians were worried about it, but came around to it by 1928. But after 1929, the riots of 1929, Britain decided that it's impossible to maintain a unitary political structure for Palestine, and decided instead that the road should be partition. And with that, we had the Peel Commission. The Peel Commission is the first, in 1937, the first proposal for dividing Palestine. And then we have the UN Partition Plan of 1947, UN Partition Plan 181, which called for the division of Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, that's where so in other words, we start with a unitary solution, we go to a partition solution. Now, let's see on the Zionist argument, is where there's some Zionist supporter of the one-state idea. And indeed, there was a strong support, not in number, but in intellectuals. Among the Zionist community, the most vocal about a one-state solution is a group called Brit Shalom, which was formed in 1925 and re-emerged as another group called Ihud in 1942. They had important Jewish intellectuals, including Martin Buber, who then became professor in the US, Yehuda Magnus, who was the first chancellor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and important business people like Moses Shmelansky. This group, they very much advocated an idea of a binational state, and they were prominent enough to be able to speak in front of the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry that came to investigate the problem in 1946, and also they presented to the UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, the committee that came from the UN in 1946-47 to Palestine, and came up with two reports about how to solve the problem in Palestine. Now, it's important to see that their ideas were important insofar as they tended to see Zionism. They were Zionists insofar that they believed that the Jews have a right to their home, to a national home. But they maintained that one has to separate between the nation and the state. Magnus argued that the Jewish people do not need a Jewish state to maintain their existence, and that a Jewish nation did not need to be conceptualized or guaranteed in territorial terms. For them, it was possible to have a union of Jews and Arabs in a binational Palestine based on parity of two people. Here I'm quoting. They further say that, I'm quoting again, the two nations have equal freedom and independence, equal participation in government, and equality of representation, and one people should not be stronger than the other. They must form a country of nationalities. This is very different from a nationalistic country. In other words, they were able to accommodate the idea that you can have more than one nation, in other words, people who speak their language, who want to govern themselves locally, within one single state. Now, the protagonist, the Zionist protagonist of the one-state solution, which we find in the Ehud documents, emphasize three very important notions. First, they emphasize the notion of equality. They acknowledge that Palestinians have a right to self-determination, just as the Jews have a right to self-determination. And with that, they argue that the Arabs of Palestine have natural rights to Palestine, just as the Jews have historic rights to Palestine. Secondly, they emphasize this important distinction between the nation and the state. They believe that sovereignty lied in the people, okay, not in the land. So the Jewish people and the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. They are sovereign people, that they can be united together in one state. Very much a little bit like the EU today, or in their example, they thought of the Habsburg Empire. And it's very appropriate talking here in Vienna, which was the leader of, to talk about the Habsburg system was a very attractive system to these thinkers, because it was, at the time of reform in the 19th century, they were trying to accommodate nationalism within a flexible state structure. Thirdly, the third rationale for the one-state solution, the binational state, from the Zionist point of view, was the question of domination. They wanted a one state because they argued that's the only way how you will not have one group dominating the other. You will not have the Palestinian dominating the Jews, and nor will you have the Zionists dominating the Palestinian, because for you, the Magnus and these thinkers, creating a state on injustice will violate the legality of the state. And he also thought, from a practical point of view, it would have been impossible in 1947. Creating a Jewish state would have meant war. And if you create a state by war, then you're going to create just antagonism around you, which leads what Buber said, you would lead to suicide, a Jewish suicide, and that was wrong. So these ideas were very important and resurrected again with Azmi Bshara, the Palestinian citizen of Israel who was a member of Knesset in the 1990s before he was expelled from Israel in 2005. Azmi Bshara talked about a state for all of its citizens in the 1990s. These ideas were taken up also by Edward Said. The idea that the state has to protect citizens' rights irrespective of their nationality. So that was if you want, the Zionist or the Jewish version of a binational state. Now, what is the Palestinian idea? We find that the Palestinian also came up with the idea of a one-state solution, particularly with a document published by the PLO in 1970 called Towards a Democratic State in Palestine for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. But it became the document that was adopted by the PLO in 1971. In 1971, the motto of the PLO, the slogan of the PLO, and Bruno Kreisky knows about that very well and had a very important role in promoting it in Europe in the 1970s and 80s. The idea was what the Palestinians want, what the Palestinian revolution wants, was to liberate Palestine and create a democratic state that would be inclusive of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Now, this was a very important and revolutionary document at the time because it was the first official attempt by the Palestinian national movement to accept Jewish existence on the land. In other words, it acknowledged that Israelis will be part of the state. It acknowledged that Jews can be in Palestine. And it acknowledged the Jews that were in Palestine after 48, not just before 48. In other words, it accepted the result of what Zionism created. But, very clearly, it accepted the Jews as having political individual rights, not collective national rights. And the reason why it did not acknowledge that the Jews have national rights is because, in their point of view, the Jews, and I'm quoting here, it says, religious and ethnic lines cross in Palestine so that to make the term binational and the Arab-Jewish dichotomy meaningless and at best dubious. The document does not consider the Jews form a nation and refuses to treat them as a religious group either. It rather considers the Jews to be a diverse group of people of different nationalities. You have the Arab Jews, you have the German Jews, you have the American Jews, but you cannot group them in one nationality calling it Israel that groups all Jews from all over the world. Because central to the Palestinian vision of a democratic state was this idea of separating the Jewish people from the Zionists. The Zionists are the colonialists. The Jewish people are people who have a right to Palestine like anybody else. Now, as we know, this idea was shelved because the international verdict, as I explained, has been since 1947 that the only solution to Palestine is partition. But it's important here that I point out that when United Nations Special Committee on Palestine came to Palestine in 1947, it produced two reports. We know the majority report. We call it majority because it was produced by 9 judges who were on this committee. The committee had 11 judges. 9 judges produced a partition plan, which called for economic union, by the way, and it was voted by the UN, and it got 2/3 majority. But the minority report produced by 3 judges actually called for a binational state in Palestine. And this report was also submitted to the United Nations General Assembly and got 50% of the vote. In other words, already the international community was thinking that partition might not really work. And partition is problematic on a moral point of view, on a ethical point of view, but also on practical economic and practical political point of view. So we've talked enough of why the two-state solution did not work. And the question then today is why these ideas that have been about the one state, presented by the international community, presented by some Zionist thinker, presented by the PLO for very long. It was the platform of the PLO from 1971 until 88. Can it be revived today, or is it just, vague talk? And I think there are 3 things that really help the proponent of the one-state idea today. First thing, what helps the one-state today is the fact that the two-state solution has been tried and failed. Okay? People tried it. We tried separation, partition. What partition today translates into segregation, does not translate into 2 sovereign states. Secondly, demographically, today in Israel-Palestine, Jews and Arabs are at near demographic parity. We have around 6.2 million Jews, and we have around 1.7 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, and another 4.2 Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. This comes around to 6.2 versus 5.9 million people, which means by 2025 we will be at parity. But in this demographic reality, only Israelis have full political rights, and Palestinians are deprived of full political rights, especially in the West Bank and Gaza. And Palestinian citizens of Israel still witness discrimination and are not recognized in their collective rights. So this demographic reality poses an important challenge for how long will you keep half your population under your control without rights. And thirdly is the question that, as Tariq explained, economically, we have one economy, basically. We have an Israeli dominant economy dominating a Palestinian economy that cannot stand on its own feet. So those who are trying to revive the binational state today, what arguments, what are they trying to do in order to revive the alternative to partition? And here what we find, and that's why the survey that was conducted as part of this research very interesting, when we went and asked the people what do they think, Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza, and even those inside 48, do you still want a Palestinian state? And we find that the majority, over 80%, are still supportive of a Palestinian state. And when you ask them, why do you want a Palestinian state, you will be amazed what is the answer for that. We want a Palestinian state because we want a passport. And why do you want a passport? Because I want to be able to move freely. So there is not a conception of the state as a state that protects the rights of the citizens. There's a conception of the state as a possibility to have a passport so you can travel. Okay? That was already alarming. Okay? When we asked them, what do you think of a one-state democratic state in Palestine, inclusive of Israelis and Palestinians, we found that 60% said, no, we reject this idea. And when we asked them, why do you reject a state with the Israelis, the argument was because Israel would reject it anyway. Israel is not willing to give us even a small state. How do you want that they will give us share with them their state? So when you dig a little bit deeper, you ask, so why is it, what do you think is needed in order to start to think about a one state with the Israelis? And they said, you need to end the occupation. You need to end Israeli domination. And we need to have some mechanism of reconciliation. So in going to discuss forward with the one state idea, what we find is that we are being re-questioned today in the 21st century about the issue of self-determination. Is self-determination only protected in a state form? And what we find is that people are still obsessed with the state as an idea, but on the ground, what we see is that state power has been eroded. Palestinians do not have state power, and even Israel as a state, its power is eroded, like all states, through international law, through international terrorism, through international trade, through globalization. Power does not lie just in the state, and being fixated just on the state ends up prioritizing certain group of people who have that power and excluding others, in the Palestinian case, excluding the refugees and excluding the diaspora, who are a central part of the Palestinian nation. So I think maybe the parallel state structure can be a way to accommodate the recognition and the creation of the two states and tries to put them together in one state. But then there is the question of domination. How can we go forward? Can we go forward without tackling Israel colonial domination? And I think the answer is clearly no. Now, it's problematic from an Israeli point of view because Israelis do not consider themselves to be colonialist. They consider themselves to just live in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and the Palestinians are just, either they don't see them because they are behind a wall that they don't know that they even exist, because if you walk on Route 6, which is where the wall passes on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side you don't see the wall, you just see some greenery because the wall is hidden, okay? Or they argue, well, no, they are terrorists, the Palestinians do not want us, they want to destroy Israel, and as such we cannot talk with them. But actually this camouflages a relationship of power. Israel is dominant and Israel is being absolved of its responsibility. And I think in any attempt to move forward, it's impossible to move forward before holding Israel accountable to international law and holding Israel committed to the agreement it signed on. So that's a very important step. But there's a last point which is very important and I want to mention before I end, which is the issue of we need to discuss how in any phase of a one-state solution we need to do reconciliation, historical reconciliation. Now, the Oslo peace process, as I said earlier, and also the two-state solution, has been based on the idea that historical reconciliation can be done on the basis of mutual recognition and territorial exchange. It was based on the formula is that we should not discuss the problem of 48, what happened with the creation of the State of Israel. We should focus on what happened since 1967. Now, the fact of the matter is, sadly, Israel even did not stick to that commitment. Israel did not stick to try to solve the problem in 1967 because Israel expanded the settlements, Israel expanded the checkpoints, Israel built the wall, which in a way jeopardized even that historical reconciliation. So I think we reached a point whereby we need to go back to the basis of the problem of 1948. Israel's creation. Israel needs to admit the sinful creation of Israel. This does not mean that Israel needs to vanish, but it does mean that Israel needs to come to terms with the injustices that were done in 1948. So the right of return has to be upheld, restitution, repatriation needs to be upheld, just as the right of Israel to exist has to be upheld. So on the Palestinian side, the major problem is, or the major challenge, is that the Palestinians cannot remain stuck in the model of 1971. They need to confront the issue of Jewish collective rights. And what are the collective rights of Jews in a new state? In other words, they need to have Palestinians need to accept that today we have Israelis who want to speak Hebrew, who feel more linked to the West than they feel linked to the East. They are there is half of them are of Arab origin, and this Arab origin or the Arab Jew need to be rehabilitated. But also Israel is a cosmopolitan, multicultural society, and this multicultural society needs to be accepted rather than negated, but not at the expense of the Palestinians. On the Israeli side, I think apart from recognizing its colonial structure and needs to dismantle it, this is not an easy thing to do for any colonialist. Nobody gives up their power easily, and nobody, above all, likes to shatter an image of being the eternal victim. How can the eternal victim become a colonizer? But these are facts of history, and one needs to face them rather than negate them. This does not mean that Israel should not exist, but it does mean that Zionism is problematic and needs to cope with Palestinian collective rights. And in that respect, I think what Israel needs to do, and it's very hard to do, apart from admitting its colonial foundation and dynamic of domination, but also grapple with the Arab question. Israel refused to deal with the Arab question, continued to consider that the Arabs, with Oslo, it admitted the existence of the Palestinian people. That's a major concession. But it also needs to admit that half of its population are of Arab origins. Today, the majority of Jews are of Mizrahim and not Ashkenazim origin. This Arab origin needs to be recognized, not negated. And Israel needs to find a way by which however much it wants to be part of Europe and is doing everything to be in the EU, it is in the Middle East and needs to live with its Arab neighbors and live as equal, not as dominant or persecuted. And these are difficult questions for Israel to address, just as it is also a difficult question for the Palestinians to address. I'll finish at this and I'll take comments.
Thank you, Leila, very much. And I would ask you to comment on what we heard right now.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, both of you, for very inspiring contributions. I have the privilege, although I'm defined as a discussant, to extend my mandate of a discussant, and I would like to invite you to a journey that people like Leila and others took upon themselves with us in the last years, to alternatives to partition. So I would like to take the first part of the question of the panel, which is alternatives to partition, and focus on this. Mr. Chairman first mentioned the publication that the Kreisky Forum was just putting on the market in 2014, in December 2014, and Leila is one of the contributors among others. And this group of people were working with us in the last 4 years to develop alternatives to partition, to develop an out-of-the-box thinking, to rethinking the politics of Israel-Palestine. So, as I mentioned before, it was thanks to one of our colleagues from Jerusalem, Dr. Bashir, that we engaged into this Alternatives to Partition project. And we developed together with academics, political activists, politicians, and other professionals from the region a new approach to Jewish-Israeli-Palestinian peace and reconciliation. In the light of the continuous impasses in the Middle East peace process and the demise of the two-state solution, like my colleagues before already mentioned, the project sought to expand the vocabularies of the debate on the Israel-Palestine conflict and to critically examine and explore feasibly and fairly just, normative, and institutional alternatives to partition that would secure national and individual rights, claims, and identities. And I'm very happy to have this historical comparison that Leila mentioned before, and which shows that the ideas are not new, but the new thing of the thinking today is that although the situation is so complicated and so hopeless, there are people like we don't so much define us among national belongings like Israelis or Palestinians. We found a very, very illuminating title. We call each other like-minded people, like-minded individuals. And this group of like-minded individuals today courageous enough, despite an Israeli society which is becoming more and more brutal. We heard before what the consequences of the situation in the region is on Palestine, which is dramatic. But I think the consequences on the Israeli society are very dramatic also, although they don't want to see it. But if you imagine that at least, without mentioning 48, but at least mentioning 67, an ongoing occupation and at least 3 generations, I would say, of young people who are serving in a very, very brutal army in horrible conditions, where they are asked to do things, young people, 18 to 20 years old people, asking to do things which transform their psyche, their innerness. And this transformation of the Israeli psyche is so much tangible today in the society, which means that the level of acknowledging the other's suffering, the other's pain, is very, very low. I mean, they are so much used to brutality, to humiliation, to I mean, I cannot watch any more videos where children are imprisoned and taken prisoners in Hebron or in other parts of Palestine. So if you are a young person who has to carry out these things, don't believe that it doesn't leave the impressions on your behavior and on your soul. So the situation in Israel itself is very complicated for like-minded people also to have the courage to speak out and to go into another thinking and into another direction. So this is why I think that the initiative that we took upon ourselves some years ago, and which luckily is going on very, very successfully, is a great proof of courage of all those who are participating in the project. It was considered at the beginning as a kind of dreamers and ivory tower exercise, which probably it was, because we were dreaming. But I think it is very important to not losing dreams and hopes in even in hopeless situations. But in the meantime, and there I must say my gratefulness goes on the international level to the European Parliament, because the European Parliament, and specifically the Social Democratic group in the European Parliament, were very, very keen in developing a different approach, a different European approach to the situation in Israel and Palestine, and supported a conference in Brussels where we were lucky also to having Leila attending and others of the group, and we presented ideas of alternatives to partition, which are based on 5 guiding principles. We tried to define our approach by agreeing, both groups, all of the like-minded people, to a certain set of guiding principles which have to be on the basis of a new grammar and of a new vocabulary in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. So if you allow me, I would like to introduce these principles to you, which sound very, very banal to European ears, but they are not banal in the region. So the guiding principles say, number 1, each person residing or holding residency status between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea will be granted equal individual, political, economic, and social rights, including the right to be protected and secured, to be treated equally regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, and religion, to move freely, to acquire and possess property, to sue in court, and to elect and to be elected. Number 2, the collective rights of Israeli Jews and Palestinians, linguistic, cultural, religious, and political, as already mentioned by Leila, will be guaranteed in any political framework. So what we are saying, we are not staters. We are not promoting an arrangement of 1, 2, 5, whatever numbers of states. But we assume that these rights have to be applicable in any constitutional arrangement. So it is, and it continues, it is understood that neither will solely have an exclusively sovereignty over the entire land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, including land possession, access to natural resources, and so on. Number 3 says the abolishment of all exclusive Jewish privileges, including in land possession and access to natural resources. All resources, material and political, will be redistributed based on restorative and distributive justice principle. Number 4, the recognition of the Palestinian right of return as embodied in UN Resolution 194. The implementation of this resolution will take into account the present reality on the ground and that the moral and political injustices of Palestinian dispossession of the past should not be affected by means of new injustices. Number 5, Jews and Palestinians living in the diaspora will be able to receive immunity if in danger, according to UN resolutions, and will have a privileged status in this process compared to any other ethnic and national group. Otherwise, it says, the new political institutions will legislate democratic immigration laws to regulate citizenship. And at the end, this group of people say, we believe that the mutual recognition based on these principles can advance an alternative political project in which the memories of exile and refuge will turn into an inclusive implementation of rights, citizenship, and belonging. So why I read these principles to you is because the European Union, and specifically the European Parliament, took these principles serious in terms of launching a new peace initiative where we are invited in next week in a conference in the European Parliament. And therefore, the bunch of dreamers, in a certain way, became a source of ideas. People are calling us and asking us to help them with ideas in a situation where apparently ideas are running out, people are running out of ideas. So what I wanted to share with you this initiative, because in the very gloomy situation in which Israel-Palestine is, there is still a small corner where a light, a little candle is burning and shining. And we are going to engage with, in 2 weeks' time, with a group of young activists, Palestinians and Jews from inside Israel to develop a strategy out of the specific situation, which is already a situation of coexistence inside Israel, although with two-class rights system. But the model of coexistence of Israelis, Palestinians and Israeli Jews inside Israel could help us to further develop this, the ideas of rethinking the politics of Israel and Palestine. And just a very last remark, because Leila mentioned the lack of engagement of the lack of the Jewish engagement with the Arab question and the Arab engagement with the Jewish question. We developed as a second track initiative to the alternatives to partition exactly this engagement, an engagement group of Arab and Jewish activists, intellectuals, academics to dig into the lacking engagement with the other, and to find also on a broader level, which expands the Israel-Palestine situation, but on a broader level, the engagement of Jews and Arabs in today's societies. Thank you very much.